The Romans used three types of battle styles throughout their time period: the Phalanx, the Maniple System, and the Legion. The Legion is the most memorable, though. In the early years of the Republic, they used the Phalanx, but as they expanded, they had to adapt to the land and use the Maniple System. And lastly, they used the Legion, which was really just a combination of both the systems with some stuff added in. The first of these tactics was the Phalanx, copied from the Greeks. The early Roman Republic used it because of the heavily armored neighbors they had at their doorstep. They would make a rectangular or square shape with the men, then the front line would lower their massive 20-foot pikes. Once the battle began, if a person died on the front line, then the next man would just step up and take his place. This strategy worked well against their well-armored enemies near them, but when they got to the hills of central Italy, it was a lot harder to move such a massive force with heavy armor and big weapons. The rolling hills caused problems for this Roman army. It was hard to move around hills, and once in battle, they couldn't counter attacks from the flanks, and since it took so long to move, it was really time for a new strategy. That new strategy was the Maniple System. They used 3 lines in a checkerboard formation. The first line was the Velites, or the skirmishers. They were meant to test the enemy. Once they lost a few men, they switched positions with the next line, the Hastati. They were men with normal Roman armor and weapons, but they were fresh recruits, not battle-hardened. After a while, they would eventually switch positions with the Principes, battle-hardened men that weren't very old. In time, they would switch once more with the Hastati, if necessary. The switching went on until the battle was won, letting both lines rest and keeping a constant pressure on the enemy. If the battle was going badly, they had veterans that were the oldest but most experienced, called the Triarii. The Triarii were really only brought out in really bad situations. Not only was this new technique a help in battle, but with this setup, the army could move much more fluidly. They could now counter-flank attacks, and when they came across hilly terrain, they could keep a straight line. But it was flawed. Under the heavy armies and skilled armies of the north, and against strong kingdoms, the Maniple System failed. Once again, it was just time for a new strategy. The last tactic for the Romans is the well-known legion system, thousands of men in perfect formation and months of training. It was the best fighting force of its time, and frankly, the most versatile. Men were required to bring supplies for building roads and buildings, therefore when they got somewhere, they could just build what they needed. As stated before, the legion was kind of like a combination of the two fighting forms before it. It utilizes the closeness of the phalanx with their shields overlapping. They also used spear-like weapons called pila, shorter than pikes used in the phalanx, only 2 to 3 feet long. The men were arranged in 3 lines like the Maniple System, and people on the first line got tired, the second line would just switch with them, like the Maniple System. But this is really where the similarities to the other 2 fighting styles ends. When a battle began, the first of the legion would march forward, and the front lines of both sides would be maybe 50 to 60 feet apart. That's when the first row of men launched their pila into the enemy force and then charged them. While they were charging, the second and third rows would throw their pila and fall in right behind the first row. The legion used many different formations. One of them was repel cavalry, which is where they'd just the first row would stick their pila into the ground, and the second and third rows would stab once the horses got close to the first row and had to turn around. The next they used was the Tortoise Formation, where the 2 lines behind the front raised their shields and then overlapped them. That would make it impossible for any enemies to shoot missile weapons in at them. They also used a battle tactic called the Wedge Formation, which is kind of what it sounds like. And then the opposite of it was the saw. They caved in to let an enemy wedge in, and then would just surround them and trap them. The legion also would usually carry cavalry divisions, about 300 horse riders, on their flanks to protect them from attacks in those directions. And in a legion you had smaller divisions of men, kind of like modern-day armies. The smallest was the Contubernium, a tent group, which was about 8 men. Then there was a centuria, which was about 40 men, with a centurion, or the leader. Then there was a cohort, which was about 6 centuries, which placed a cohort at about 480 men. 10 cohorts would make up a legion, the first cohort being the strongest with the most experienced men, and having slightly more men than all the other legions. What I covered in this is a really compressed information on the topic, but it does go over all the parts of the Roman battle tactics and everything they used over the years that they were around.